At 6:12 on a cold Monday morning, I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee and found an excavator tearing through the oldest row of pear trees on my land. Not beside the orchard, not near the fence, but 20 yards inside my property. Its steel tracks grinding across roots my grandfather had spent half a century protecting. A woman in a navy raincoat stood beside it, with a clipboard tucked under one arm. And when I told her to shut the machine down, she smiled like I had just interrupted a meeting she was running. My name is Mason Holloway, and until that morning, I honestly believed most problems could be solved with a calm voice, a firm handshake, and maybe a second cup of coffee. I was 53 years old, divorced, reasonably patient, and living on 47 acres outside a little town called Bellwether, Tennessee. Well, my family had grown pears, peaches, and stubborn opinions since 1968. My grandfather, Silas Holloway, bought the place when the hillside was mostly rock, briars, and red clay, and he spent the next 30 years turning it into something that looked almost impossible in late summer. Rows of fruit trees rolling down the slope, bees drifting through the white blossoms, wooden crates stacked beside the packing shed, the whole property smelling like warm grass and sweet fruit. My father kept it alive after him, and when he passed, I came back from Knoxville, sold my share in a small construction company, and took over the orchard full-time. It was not a glamorous life, but it was mine, and more important, it was theirs before it was mine. The woman with the clipboard introduced herself as Meredith Sloan, president of the Silver Pines Community Association, a private neighborhood built on the ridge above my land. She was in her late 50s. Silver blonde hair cut into a perfect chin-length bob, spotless leather boots despite the mud, and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once apologized without first consulting legal counsel. She pointed toward the excavator and said they were beginning emergency drainage improvements. I looked past her at the operator, who suddenly found the inside of his cab fascinating, then back at the freshly torn earth beneath one of my Bartlett pear trees. "Emergency for who?" I asked. Meredith pulled a packet from her clipboard and tapped one page with a manicured fingernail. According to her, I had been formally notified 3 times, given 72 hours to comply, and failed to respond. I told her I had received exactly 1 letter, 6 months earlier, and that letter said nothing about entering my property with heavy equipment. She tilted her head, almost sympathetically, and said, "You may want to review Section 9 before making accusations." Mr. Holloway, I had never seen Section 9. She knew it. I knew she knew it. And for a few seconds, the only sound between us was diesel rumbling and branches cracking behind her. I told the operator to shut the machine off. He glanced at Meredith. That told me everything I needed to know about who had hired him. Meredith stepped closer and lowered her voice. Not threatening exactly, but enjoying the shape of it. "The association has legal authority to protect its residents from stormwater risk," she said. "Cooperation would make this easier for everyone." That phrase, "easier for everyone," has probably preceded more theft, bullying, and small-town corruption than any sentence in the English language. I looked at the tree nearest the excavator, an old Bartlett my grandfather planted in 1972, its trunk scarred by lightning, pruning, and one memorable incident involving a tractor, a loose chain, and my father refusing to admit he had misjudged a turn. Then I looked back at Meredith and said, "All right." She smiled because she thought I had surrendered. What I meant was, all right, now I know what kind of fight this is. Silver Pines had not existed when I was a kid. Back then, the ridge above us was timber and abandoned cattle pasture, good for deer and not much else. 9 years before the excavator showed up, a developer named Roland Kessler bought 240 acres, cleared the ridge, cut roads into the slope, and built 78 expensive homes with stone mailboxes, decorative ponds, and names like Aspen Court despite there not being an aspen tree within 100 miles. Roland marketed Silver Pines as elevated country living, which meant people paid city prices to complain about coyotes, leaf blowers, and the smell of manure from farms that had been there before their houses. The development had a clubhouse, a pool, a walking trail, and a homeowners association that began with simple duties like landscaping and trash contracts, then slowly evolved into Meredith Sloan issuing violation notices because someone's mulch was the wrong shade of brown. My first interaction with her happened 8 months earlier, when she appeared at my kitchen door carrying a map rolled under one arm. It was October, harvest season, and I was already behind on everything: Pears were stacked in crates beneath the shed roof. The phone would not stop ringing, and one of my refrigerated trucks had decided that keeping things cold was more of a suggestion than a job requirement. Meredith came in smiling, refused coffee, and spread the map across my kitchen table. Silver Pines, she explained, had developed a drainage problem along its southern boundary. Several yards flooded during heavy storms. One retaining wall had shifted, and the association's engineer had concluded that the natural solution was to cut a runoff channel across the lower portion of my orchard. She used the word natural 3 times in 10 minutes, which was interesting because the proposed channel did not exist anywhere in nature. It was a straight engineered trench beginning at their detention pond, crossing my eastern pasture, and running directly through a row of productive pear trees toward the county ditch. I asked why they did not expand their own pond. She said that would be prohibitively expensive. I asked why they did not route the water along their western common area. She said that would interfere with the walking trail. I asked why their convenience had become my obligation. That was the first moment her smile changed. Not disappeared exactly, but tightened around the edges. She told me Tennessee law required lower landowners to accept natural runoff from higher property. That part was true, and she clearly expected that truth to carry the rest of her argument. But there is a difference between accepting water that naturally flows downhill and accepting thousands of gallons redirected by grading, pavement, rooftops, and a developer who built 78 houses without enough drainage capacity. I told her I would review the documents. She thanked me for my cooperation, gathered her map, and left. Again, I had not agreed to anything. I should have called a lawyer that afternoon. Instead, I slid the packet beneath a stack of produce invoices and went back to work. 3 weeks later, I wrote the association asking for the engineering study, the survey, and any recorded easement giving them access to my land. Meredith answered with a letter from the County Development Office stating that adjacent property owners were encouraged to support reasonable stormwater improvements. Encouraged. Not required, not ordered. Encouraged. It was the sort of official-sounding word meant to make ordinary people feel like resistance was already illegal and might have ignored it longer. Except my neighbor, Ruth Calder, called me one rainy Thursday evening and asked why my orchard was listed on the county planning agenda as a proposed regional drainage facility. Ruth was 71, raised goats, attended every public meeting within 30 miles, and possessed the level of local intelligence that would have embarrassed federal agencies. I drove to the county office the next morning, requested the file, and found 46 pages of maps, drone photographs, flow calculations, and one sentence that turned my confusion into something colder. The application described Holloway Orchard as a declining agricultural property with limited commercial activity and minimal long-term community value. I read it twice, then a third time, because I wanted to be sure anger was not changing the words. That orchard supplied 4 restaurants, 2 farm markets, a school lunch program, and nearly 20,000 pounds of fruit a year. Meredith had not merely asked to use my land. She had built her entire legal argument on the claim that what my family had spent 50 years creating no longer mattered. I closed the file, drove home without turning on the radio, walked through the lower rows until the sun went down, and called a land use attorney named Jonah Mercer, a man whose first words after reading the application were, "She did her homework, but she counted on you not doing yours." Jonah Mercer had practiced property law in Bellwether County for 32 years, and he had the slow, almost irritating calm of a man who had watched too many loud people destroy themselves by speaking before they understood the paperwork. His office occupied the 2nd floor of an old brick bank building downtown, above a tax preparer and across from a diner where the coffee could remove paint. And when I handed him the county file, he read every page without saying much, just making small pencil marks in the margins, while I sat across from him trying not to imagine another excavator chewing through my orchard. Finally, he leaned back and said Meredith's application was clever because it did not ask the county to seize my land directly. It asked the county to classify part of it as necessary drainage infrastructure, which would make the HOA's plan look less like trespassing and more like public safety. The weakness, he said, was that the county could not impose that burden on active agricultural land unless Silver Pines proved there was no practical alternative. And Meredith had built her case around 2 claims: that my orchard was barely operating and that the route through my property was the only workable solution. Both claims were false, but false claims do not collapse by themselves. Somebody has to put weight on them. Jonah told me we needed production records, tax filings, customer statements, photographs, soil reports, anything showing the orchard was not some abandoned family hobby. Then he asked whether I knew anyone who understood drainage. I told him about Leon Dougherty, my neighbor from 2 farms over, a retired highway engineer who kept survey equipment in his garage the way other men kept fishing rods. Leon was 76, broad-shouldered, permanently sunburned, and incapable of giving a short answer to any question involving water, concrete, or county incompetence. He came over that evening carrying a thermos, a folding map table, and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting so small it looked machine-printed. We spread the HOA plans across my kitchen table, and he studied them for nearly an hour before tapping one corner with his finger. They picked your land because it is cheaper, he said. Not safer, not better, cheaper. Silver Pines owned 2 undeveloped common lots on the western side of the ridge, and either one could carry a drainage line to the county right-of-way, but that route would require removing part of their decorative walking trail and expanding a culvert. The developer could also enlarge the existing detention pond, but that would cost real money and might require closing the clubhouse pool for a season. Running the channel through my orchard meant losing a few trees that did not belong to them, which in Meredith's arithmetic apparently counted as free. Leon spent the next 4 weeks building an alternative drainage report, with help from his granddaughter Paige, who was finishing her civil engineering degree at Tennessee Tech and had the dangerous enthusiasm of a young person who had just discovered adults in authority could be mathematically wrong. Together, they identified 3 workable routes, 2 across HOA property and 1 along the county road, all of them more expensive than cutting through my land, but none of them impossible. While they worked, Jonah told me to make the orchard's value impossible to ignore. So I did something my father would have called shameless and my grandfather would have secretly enjoyed. I held a winter market in the packing barn. I invited every restaurant we supplied, the Farm Bureau, local teachers, the county newspaper, and anybody who had ever bought a jar of pear preserves from us. 230 people showed up on a cold Saturday under strings of work lights, eating pear cobbler, drinking hot cider, listening to a 3-piece bluegrass band play beside the sorting tables. I hung the large sign over the barn doors listing our annual production, 19,600 pounds of fruit, 4 restaurant accounts, 2 farmers markets, 1 school nutrition contract, 11 seasonal workers, continuous family operation since 1968. A reporter named Dana Bell took a photograph of that sign and then asked me why Silver Pines had called the orchard a declining property. I told her the truth, calmly, because anger is useful in private, but documentation plays better in print. Her article ran 3 days later under the headline, Historic Holloway Orchard, Threatened by Private Drainage Plan, and by lunch Meredith had called the newspaper twice, the county administrator once, and me 4 times. I did not answer. Instead, Jonah filed our formal opposition with Leon's engineering report attached. Meredith responded with a supplemental statement claiming the winter market was a manufactured publicity event, and 1 successful season did not prove long-term agricultural use. Buried near the end, she repeated that the channel through my orchard was the only technically feasible route. Leon read that sentence at my kitchen table, removed his glasses, and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a retired engineer who had just been told his 48-page report did not exist. The public hearing was scheduled for January, and the room filled before the doors officially opened. Silver Pines residents came expecting to hear about an uncooperative farmer endangering their homes, but they watched Leon project map after map showing routes across land their own association already owned. Paige explained the flow calculations in plain English and pointed out that the HOA's detention pond had been designed around an assumption that excess water could eventually be sent through my property, even though no easement had ever been purchased. Ruth spoke about the Orchard School program. 3 restaurant owners described how much business they did with us. Then, a Silver Pines homeowner named Daniel Cross stood and asked Meredith a question she clearly had not prepared for. He wanted to know why the HOA had spent more than $40,000 on consultants and attorneys, without first asking residents whether they preferred expanding their own pond. Meredith said the board had acted under emergency authority. Daniel asked where the emergency declaration was recorded. She said the records were being compiled. Jonah leaned toward me and whispered, "That means there is no record." The Planning Commission voted to postpone the designation and ordered an independent review of alternatives. People applauded, not loudly, but enough for Meredith to hear it. Outside the building, she walked past me without speaking, then stopped beside her car and said, "You understand delay does not solve the drainage problem." I said, "Neither does pretending my land belongs to you." She looked at me for a long second and replied, "Some people only understand consequences when they become expensive." I thought she was warning me. I did not realize she was describing herself. 6 weeks later, on a frozen February morning, I found a section of my eastern fence cut open and a survey crew standing between two rows of pear trees. They wore orange vests, carried wooden stakes, and had arrived in a truck marked Silver Pines Community Association. One man was driving stakes into the soil within the root zone of a 50-year-old bosque pear. I took photographs before I spoke. Then I called Jonah. By noon, he had obtained an emergency restraining order, and by mid-afternoon, the crew was gone. But the damage was already there. 6 fence posts cut, deep tire ruts across wet ground, and 2 old trees with roots torn by stakes and equipment. One survived. The boss did not. By April, its leaves came in thin and gray, then curled, then never returned. An arborist valued the tree, its production, age, condition, and replacement cost at nearly $9,000. Silver Pines offered me $450. Meredith's attorney called it a generous compromise for one aging fruit tree. I sat in Jonah's office holding that letter, while something inside me became very still. I was no longer interested in convincing Meredith to behave reasonably. I wanted every lie exposed, every shortcut priced correctly, and every person she had bullied to see exactly how little authority she actually possessed. Jonah listened while I said all of that, then poured us both coffee and told me anger made terrible plans unless you gave it structure. He divided our response into 3 parts: legal, public, and physical. Legally, we sued the HOA for trespass, property damage, and intentional interference with an agricultural operation. Publicly, we filed an ethics complaint against county official Edwin Mallory, whose encouraging letter had been written on government stationery after private conversations with Meredith's vice president. Physically, Jonah wanted to know whether I had ever considered improving my own drainage. That question sounded harmless until Leon unfolded a new map. His alternative study had shown something nobody at Silver Pines seemed to understand. If my lower orchard no longer accepted the runoff they wanted to force through it, the water would follow the next natural swale eastward, directly toward the HOA's undersized detention pond. I stared at the map, then at Leon. "Are you telling me I can block their water?" I asked. Leon shook his head. "Not block it. Protect your orchard from it. French drains, a shallow retention swale, and a grass berm, all standard agricultural improvements. The water would not be concentrated or aimed at anybody. It would simply stop using your trees as unpaid infrastructure and return to the secondary drainage path." Jonah added that every permit would need to be proper, every calculation reviewed, every purpose legitimate, because the difference between justice and revenge is usually found in the paperwork. Page designed the system after graduation. The County Agricultural Extension Office reviewed it, and we submitted every permit openly. The plan protected root zones from oversaturation, improved soil drainage, and redirected sheet flow toward the natural eastern swale. Nobody could honestly call it sabotage. Meredith tried anyway. She sent letters to all 78 homeowners claiming I was making unauthorized land alterations that threatened community safety. She requested another inspection, then another, and each time the county found the same thing: permitted agricultural drainage, properly engineered, fully documented. She hired a larger law firm from Nashville and filed for an injunction to stop construction. The judge denied it in less than 20 minutes. By late September, the system was complete, the French drains buried, the grass berms settled into the slope so gently it looked as if it had always been there. Leon walked the finished route with a hand level, checking grades, then looked toward the ridge. "First serious fall storm," he said. "Their pond is going to discover what all those rooftops actually weigh." I asked how serious. He slid his hands into his coat pockets and said, "Serious enough that they are finally going to read my report." 3 days later, the Weather Service announced a slow-moving October storm expected to drop nearly 5 inches of rain across Bellwether County. And that afternoon, as the first dark clouds gathered above Silver Pines, Meredith drove past my driveway, slowed beside the orchard, stared at the new green berm, and for the first time since I had met her, she did not look certain of anything. The rain started just after sunset, soft at first, ticking against the windows and whispering through the pear leaves. Then by midnight, it had settled into a hard, steady downpour that made the gutters groan and turned the county road into a black ribbon of moving water. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, drinking coffee I did not need, listening to the storm work its way across land my family had spent half a century learning how to read. The new drains beneath the orchard pulled water away from the roots exactly as Paige had designed. The shallow berms slowed the surface flow, and instead of soaking into the lower rows or cutting through my trees, the water spread east toward the secondary swale that had always existed before Roland Kessler covered the ridge with roofs, pavement, and expensive landscaping. I told myself I had done nothing wrong, and legally that was true. Every permit had been approved, every drawing reviewed, every consequence documented in Leon's report months earlier. But knowing you are right does not make it easy to sit in the dark and wait for someone else's bad decision to arrive downstream. At 5048 the next morning, my phone rang. The caller was Daniel Cross, the Silver Pines resident who had questioned Meredith at the hearing. His voice was tight and breathless. He asked whether I had changed the drainage on my property. I said I had completed permitted agricultural improvements to protect the orchard from excess runoff. He said the detention pond was overflowing. Water was moving through the southern yards, and his neighbor's patio was already under 6 inches of muddy water. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Did you know this would happen? I looked through the kitchen window at the rain pouring off the barn roof and said, Leon's report warned that your pond was undersized if my property stopped serving as an unofficial overflow route. That report was submitted publicly in January. There was a long silence. Then Daniel said, Meredith told us your engineer was exaggerating. I answered, Leon is not my engineer. He is a retired highway engineer who dislikes exaggeration almost as much as he dislikes decorative ponds. Daniel did not laugh. He said he needed the report, so I emailed it to him before we hung up. By 7 o'clock, Ruth was calling with updates, because Ruth somehow knew more about Silver Pines than most people who live there. The detention pond had reached capacity shortly after 3 in the morning, overtopped the emergency spillway, and sent a wide sheet of water to the lowest corner of the development. 10 backyards were flooded. 3 retaining walls had partially collapsed. Mulch and patio furniture were floating across the walking trail, and the clubhouse pool had turned the color of chocolate milk. Nobody was injured, and no houses took water inside. But the pickleball court was submerged deep enough that one resident's plastic paddle drifted into the parking lot, which even Leon admitted was an improvement to the neighborhood. Meredith had been calling the county since before dawn, demanding emergency action against me. The county drainage inspector reminded her that my system had been permitted, inspected, and challenged unsuccessfully in court. She called Jonah's office and threatened immediate litigation. Jonah told her firm to put everything in writing, then called me and said the most comforting words a lawyer can say during a storm. Do not touch anything. At 9:16, Meredith arrived at my house. She stepped out of her SUV into ankle-deep mud, wearing no makeup, no association badge, and no expression I had seen on her before. She looked tired, frightened, and furious that fear had found her. I met her beneath the porch roof. She did not say good morning. She said, You engineered this. I told her Paige had engineered an orchard drainage system, the same one the county approved twice. Meredith pointed toward the ridge as if the flooded yards were visible through the rain. Families are losing thousands of dollars because of you. I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice low. No, I said. Families are losing money because Roland built a neighborhood around drainage capacity he did not own. And you spent a year trying to force that capacity through my trees instead of fixing your pond. She said I had redirected the water intentionally. I told her I had protected my land intentionally, and that the difference was documented in 48 pages she had dismissed as exaggeration. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain drummed on the metal porch roof, and behind me the orchard stood dark and soaked, but unharmed. Meredith's face changed then, not into regret exactly, but into the expression of someone realizing that authority and control were not the same thing. What do you want? She asked. I told her the same thing Jonah had offered months earlier. Full compensation for the damaged trees and fence, withdrawal of the drainage designation, payment of my legal costs, and a legitimate easement negotiation only after an independent engineer reviewed every alternative. No more private crews. No more county favors. No more letters pretending encouragement meant legal authority. She stared at me and said the residents would never approve that expense. I said they might after reading Leon's report. That landed. By noon, Daniel had forwarded the report to nearly every homeowner in Silver Pines, along with Meredith's earlier letter accusing me of endangering the community. By evening, residents had discovered the HOA had spent over $60,000 on consultants and attorneys while rejecting a pond expansion that would have cost less than the legal fight. The next morning, 29 homeowners signed a petition demanding an emergency board meeting. Meredith resigned 2 days later, citing health and family reasons, which was the polished version. The unpolished version was that the residents had learned she knew about the alternative routes, knew the detention pond was undersized, and kept pushing through my orchard because it was cheaper and because by then beating me mattered more to her than solving the problem. Roland Kessler appeared at the county commission meeting the following week in a charcoal fleece vest and the expression of a man watching his profit margin leak through a failed retaining wall. Under questioning, he admitted the original site plan assumed future drainage access across my property, even though no easement had ever been purchased. He called it an administrative oversight. Leon whispered that an oversight was forgetting your anniversary, not designing 78 houses around land you did not own. Roland's company agreed to fund an independent redesign, enlarge the detention pond, repair the flooded yards, and purchase a narrow easement along my eastern boundary at fair market value. The channel never touched the orchard. The HOA paid $18,700 for the dead boss Pear, the damaged companion tree, the cut fence, and a portion of my legal fees, a little more than the $450 they had once called generous. Edwin Mallory received a formal reprimand for using county stationery to support a private application without legal review, and the county adopted a rule requiring the attorney's office to approve such letters in the future. The following spring, Paige helped me plant 2 new pear trees where the old boss had stood. They were small, almost ridiculous, beside the older trees, thin trunks tied loosely to wooden stakes. But my grandfather used to say planting an orchard was an agreement with a future you might never meet. I used part of the settlement to start a small scholarship in his name for local students studying agriculture or environmental engineering. Meredith moved out of Silver Pines the next year. I never saw her again. Some people in town say I did exactly what any landowner should do: protect the property, follow the law, and let the consequences land where the bad planning put them. Others say I knew those yards would flood and should have warned the residents personally, even after their association spent months trying to take my land. I still think about that on rainy nights, because being legally right and being completely innocent are not always the same thing. So tell me what you think. Did I defend my family's orchard, or did I take the lesson too far? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who has ever faced a bully carrying official-looking paperwork. And subscribe for more stories where ordinary people finally stop folding and start doing the homework.